I have lived on the lip of insanity, wanting to know reasons, knocking on a door. It opens. I've been knocking from the inside. There's a strange paradox at the heart of human existence. We spend our entire lives building ourselves up, constructing identities, collecting achievements, stacking credentials like armor against the void. We become doctors, artists, parents, and CEOs. We curate personalities. We refine our tastes, our opinions, and our carefully manufactured quirks that make us feel distinct, special, and irreplaceable. And yet, buried somewhere in almost every spiritual tradition, whispered by mystics and sages across millennia, is this bizarre counter-instruction. Let it all go. Become nobody. Dissolve. The self you've spent decades constructing? It's a prison. And the key to freedom is to walk away from the person you think you are. It sounds insane. It sounds like psychological suicide. But what if they're onto something? What if the architecture of selfhood that we've built so carefully is actually the source of our deepest suffering? What if becoming nobody isn't about losing yourself, but about finding something much more real? This isn't a self-help video, I promise you that. But the psychology behind this idea, this ancient practice of ego dissolution, might just be the most radical thing you'll encounter in your lifetime. It challenges everything we've been taught about success, identity, and what it means to be human. So let's explore it. Let's look at what it actually means to become nobody, why it terrifies us, and why some people claim it's the most liberating thing they've ever done. We need to start with a fundamental question. Who are you? Go on, answer it. Not out loud, obviously. But in your head, right now, who are you? If you're like most people, you probably started listing things. I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm a student, a professional, and a parent. I'm funny, I'm serious. I'm an introvert, I'm ambitious, I'm struggling, I'm successful. You might have listed your nationality, your political beliefs, or your religion, or lack thereof. Maybe you thought about your past, your traumas, your triumphs, and the stories you tell about yourself at dinner parties. All of these answers, every single one, are what psychologists call the narrative self. It's the story you tell about who you are. And here's the thing. It's not exactly false, but it's not exactly true either. It's a construction, a useful fiction, a character you've been writing and rewriting since childhood. The Buddhist monk Ajahn Chah once said something remarkable about this. He said that when you hold onto a hot coal, you suffer. And the solution isn't to find better coal or to develop thicker skin so you can hold it longer. The solution is to let go of the coal entirely. The self, he argued, is that coal. We clutch it so tightly, convince ourselves we need it, and then wonder why we're burning. Western psychology has spent over a century studying the self. Freud gave us the ego, the superego, and the id. Jung gave us the persona and the shadow. Erickson mapped out 8 stages of identity development. We've measured self-esteem, self-concept, and self-efficacy. We've built entire therapeutic models around strengthening the self, integrating the self, and loving the self. And none of this is wrong. Building a coherent sense of identity is crucial for functioning in the world. Children who don't develop a stable sense of self struggle profoundly. People with fractured identities due to trauma need therapeutic help to integrate their experiences into a cohesive narrative. But here's where it gets interesting. There's a point where that healthy self becomes a cage, where the story you tell about yourself stops being a useful tool and starts being a limitation, a boundary. A set of walls that keep out everything that doesn't fit the narrative. Psychologist Tasha Eurich studied self-awareness for years, surveying thousands of people about how well they knew themselves. What she found was disturbing. 95% of people think they're self-aware, but only 10 to 15% actually are. We're walking around convinced we know who we are, while operating on autopilot, driven by unconscious patterns we can't even see. The narrative self is sticky. It resists change. It filters experience through pre-existing beliefs about who we are and what we're capable of. If you believe you're shy, you'll interpret situations through that lens. If you believe you're a victim, or a hero, or a failure. That story will shape how you see the world and how you act in it. And the more attached we become to that story, the more we suffer when reality doesn't cooperate, when life hands us experiences that don't fit our self-concept, when we fail in ways our identity can't accommodate, when we succeed in ways that make us question everything we thought we knew about ourselves. This is where the psychology of becoming nobody begins, not with destruction, but with a question. What if the person you think you are is just one possibility among many? What if you're not actually that fixed, that solid, that definable? The neuroscience of selfhood is bizarre, and by bizarre, I mean genuinely unsettling once you understand it. There is no self in your brain, no singular location where you live, no command center where decisions are made and identity resides. Neuroscientists have been looking for decades, scanning thousands of brains, and the conclusion is clear. The self is distributed, emergent, and constantly reconstructed moment to moment. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on the external world, is often associated with self-referential thinking. It's what lights up when you daydream, when you think about your past or plan your future, when you ruminate about your problems, or when you fantasize about your success. This network creates the sense of continuity, the feeling that you're the same person who existed yesterday and will exist tomorrow. But here's the thing. You can turn it off. Meditation studies, particularly those examining long-term practitioners, show decreased activity in the default mode network during deep meditative states. The sense of being a separate self, a distinct me, observing the world from behind your eyes, it quiets. Sometimes it disappears entirely. And what do people report when this happens? Terror, sometimes. The fear of annihilation, of ceasing to exist, but also, strangely, relief, peace, a sense of vastness, connection to everything, the dissolution of the boundary between self and world. This isn't mysticism, this is measurable neuroscience. When the brain stops constantly constructing and maintaining the narrative self, something shifts. People report feeling more present, more alive, and less burdened by the weight of their own history and identity. Psychologist Sam Harris, who trained extensively in meditation, describes this experience in stark terms. He says the feeling of being a self, a subject looking out at a world of objects, is an illusion. Not in a poetic or metaphorical sense, but in a literal, cognitive sense. It's a construction the brain makes, useful for navigating social reality, but not an accurate representation of what consciousness actually is. And if that's true, if the self is more like a story the brain tells than a fundamental feature of reality, then what happens when we stop telling that story? What happens when we become nobody? The research on ego dissolution, primarily coming from psychedelic studies, offers some clues. When people take substances like psilocybin or LSD under controlled conditions, many report a temporary loss of ego boundaries. The sense of being a separate self dissolves. And surprisingly, this isn't traumatic for most people. It's often described as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Studies from Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London found that ego dissolution during psychedelic experiences correlated with long-term increases in psychological well-being, decreases in anxiety and depression, and shifts in personality toward greater openness and reduced neuroticism. People came back changed, not because they built a better self, but because they'd experienced what it was like to have no self at all, even temporarily. But you don't need psychedelics to access this. Meditation, breathwork, sensory deprivation, and even intense physical exertion can all produce similar states. What they have in common is a disruption of the normal self-construction process. The brain's habit of constantly narrating, categorizing, and reinforcing identity gets interrupted. And in that interruption, there's space. Space to see that you're not your thoughts, you're not your emotions, you're not even your body, not in the way you think. You're the awareness in which all of that appears. The problem is, we're so identified with the contents of consciousness that we forget we're also the space in which those contents arise. Becoming nobody doesn't mean becoming nothing. It means recognizing that the somebody you think you are is optional, constructed, and ultimately negotiable. Let's talk about suffering, because that's really what this is about. The Buddha, that ancient psychologist disguised as a spiritual teacher, had a pretty simple diagnosis of the human condition. We suffer. Not sometimes, not just when bad things happen, but constantly. There's a low-grade dissatisfaction humming beneath almost everything we do. A sense that something's not quite right, not quite enough, that we need to be somewhere else, someone else, doing something else. And according to the Buddha, the cause of this suffering is attachment, specifically, attachment to the illusion of a permanent, unchanging self. We cling to our identity like a life raft in the ocean. We defend it, refine it, promote it, protect it from threats. Someone criticizes us, and it feels like an attack on our very existence. Someone doesn't like us, and we spiral into self-doubt. We lose a job, a relationship, or a role we've invested ourselves in, and it feels like we're losing ourselves. This is what the Buddhists call dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately understood as a kind of fundamental unsatisfactoriness. The sense that no matter what we achieve, acquire, or become, it's never quite enough. The goalposts keep moving. The finish line keeps receding. And why? Because the self we're trying to satisfy, to complete, to perfect, is a moving target. It's not real in the way we think it is. It's a process, not a thing. A verb, not a noun. The moment you think you've nailed down who you are, life changes, you change, and suddenly that identity doesn't fit anymore. Psychologist Mark Leary has spent decades studying what he calls the curse of the self. He argues that most psychological suffering, anxiety, depression, shame, and envy stem from an overactive self-focus. We're constantly monitoring ourselves, evaluating ourselves, and comparing ourselves to others and to our own internal standards. It's exhausting. And it's largely unnecessary. Animals don't seem to suffer from this. A dog doesn't wake up wondering if it's living up to its potential. A bird doesn't compare itself to other birds and feel inadequate. They simply exist, responding to the moment, without the burden of a narrative self constantly judging and narrating their experience. But we're different. We have language, which gives us the ability to think about ourselves, to abstract, to plan, to remember, and somewhere along the way, we got stuck. We started believing the story. We forgot that the narrator is also a construction. This is where the psychology of becoming nobody offers something radical. It suggests that the solution to suffering isn't to build a better self, a more resilient self, or a more confident self. It's to loosen your grip on the whole project, to recognize that the self you're defending so fiercely is optional. Zen Buddhism has a concept called no self, or anatta. It doesn't mean you disappear. It means you stop identifying with the temporary, changing phenomena of thoughts, emotions, and sensations as fundamentally you. You're still here. You still function. You still have preferences and personality. But there's less attachment, less clinging, and less suffering. Psychologist John Wellwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe the misuse of spiritual practices to avoid dealing with psychological issues, and that's a real danger here. Becoming nobody isn't about escaping responsibility, avoiding pain, or pretending you don't have problems. It's not about dissociation or detachment in the clinical sense. It's about recognizing that you're larger than your problems, that your awareness, your consciousness, is vast enough to hold difficult experiences without being destroyed by them. When you're tightly identified with the self, every threat feels existential. But when that identification loosens, there's more resilience, more flexibility, more capacity to be with what is. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus said something similar, though in different language. He taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. The story we tell, the meaning we assign, the way we make it about ourselves, strip that away, and what's left? Just experience, just life, unfolding moment to moment. And strangely, that's often easier to bear than the weight of our narrative about it. So, how does one actually become nobody? Because it's one thing to talk about it philosophically and another thing entirely to live it. Let's start with what it's not. It's not about destroying your personality or becoming some bland, emotionless automaton. It's not about rejecting your history or pretending you don't have preferences. People who've genuinely touched this state, who've experienced ego dissolution and come back, are still themselves in a recognizable sense. They still laugh, cry, get annoyed, and have opinions. But something's different. There's less identification, less defense, and less need to be right or to be seen a certain way. They're more at ease with contradiction, more comfortable with uncertainty, and less attached to outcomes. The path to this, in almost every tradition that talks about it, involves some form of meditation or contemplative practice. Not because meditation is magic, but because it trains you to observe your own mind without getting lost in it. It creates a gap between experience and reaction, between thought and identification with thought. Vipassana meditation, for instance, is explicitly designed to deconstruct the sense of self. You sit, you observe sensations in the body, and you watch thoughts arise and pass. The instruction is simple: just observe. Don't judge, don't analyze, and don't get involved. Just watch. And what happens over time is you start to see that thoughts aren't you. They're just thoughts. They arise from nowhere. They pass away into nowhere. Same with emotions. Same with sensations. They're all temporary phenomena, coming and going in awareness like clouds passing through the sky. The sky doesn't cling to clouds. It doesn't identify with them. It just lets them pass. And gradually, through practice, you start to recognize yourself as the sky, not the clouds. But meditation isn't the only path. Any practice that disrupts habitual self-construction can work. Intense physical activity, where you push yourself to the point that the thinking mind shuts down and you're just pure presence. Art, where you lose yourself so completely in the creative process that hours pass without notice. Deep conversation, where you forget to monitor yourself and just speak from a place beyond self-consciousness. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called this flow, that state where the sense of self disappears, where action and awareness merge, where there's no gap between you and what you're doing. Athletes call it the zone. Artists call it the muse. It's a temporary dissolution of the ego, and it's often described as one of the most fulfilling experiences humans can have. The difference between flow states and deeper ego dissolution is duration and depth. Flow is temporary and usually task-specific. But the kind of transformation we're talking about, becoming nobody in a more permanent sense, involves a fundamental shift in how you relate to yourself all the time, not just during peak experiences. Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield talks about this as losing yourself in yourself. The small self, the ego, the narrative identity, dissolves into something larger. Not into nothing, but into everything, into awareness itself, into being, into what some traditions call the true self, or Buddha nature, or the ground of being. And here's where it gets tricky, because we're bumping up against the limits of language. How do you describe the experience of having no experience? How do you talk about what it's like to be nobody when language itself is built on the assumption of a somebody speaking? This is why mystics across traditions resort to paradox, poetry, and silence. It's why Zen masters hit their students with sticks and speak in riddles. It's why Rumi wrote about being drunk on the invisible wine. They're not being obscure for the sake of it. They're trying to point at something that can't quite be captured in words. But practically, in your daily life, becoming nobody looks like this. Less inner commentary, less second-guessing, less rumination about past conversations or anxiety about future ones. More presence, more spontaneity, more capacity to respond to what's actually happening instead of to your story about what's happening. It looks like being able to receive criticism without immediately defending yourself, being able to fail without your entire self-worth collapsing, being able to succeed without needing to make it mean something about how special you are. It looks like freedom, but let's be honest, this sounds terrifying. The idea of losing yourself, even if it's supposed to be liberating, triggers something primal. Because who will you be if you're not you? What will motivate you if you're not trying to prove something, achieve something, or become something? Won't you just stop functioning? This fear is legitimate, and it points to something important. The self isn't just a source of suffering, it's also useful. We need a coherent sense of identity to navigate the world. We need goals, plans, values, and boundaries. We need to remember who we are, who we've been, and who we want to become. The psychology of becoming nobody isn't about destroying the functional self. It's about no longer being imprisoned by it. Think of it like this. When you're watching a movie, you know it's a movie. You know the characters aren't real, that the story is fictional, but you still get absorbed in it. You still feel emotions, care about what happens, laugh and cry, and get invested. The movie works precisely because you temporarily suspend disbelief. But you never completely forget that it's a movie. And if someone yells fire in the theater, you don't stay in your seat because your favorite character is about to win the big game. You remember it's not real, and you leave. The self is like that movie. You can engage with it, play your role, and get invested in the plot. But you don't have to believe it's ultimately real. You can hold it lightly. You can remember that beneath the character you're playing, there's an awareness that's witnessing the whole thing. This is what the Hindu tradition calls Leela, the divine play. Life as a game, a performance, something to be enjoyed but not clung to. You play your part fully, but you remember it's a part. And that remembering, that lightness, that's where the freedom is. Psychologically, this looks like what some researchers call psychological flexibility, the ability to shift perspectives, to hold multiple viewpoints simultaneously, and to see yourself from the outside without being trapped inside your own subjective experience. Studies on psychological flexibility show it's one of the strongest predictors of mental health. People who can step back from their thoughts and feelings, who can observe them without being overwhelmed by them, suffer less from anxiety, depression, and stress. They're more resilient, more adaptable, and more capable of navigating life's inevitable difficulties. But there's a deeper layer here, because even psychological flexibility still assumes there's a self who's being flexible. What we're pointing at is something more fundamental. The recognition that the observer itself, the one who's stepping back, is not a thing either. It's not another self, a higher self, or a true self. It's just awareness. Empty, spacious, without qualities or characteristics. The mystics call this the void, the emptiness, sunyata in Buddhism, and it terrifies the ego because the ego can't exist there. It's like asking a wave to exist without the ocean. The wave is the ocean, just temporarily taking a particular form. But if you can tolerate that fear, if you can sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of not being, something remarkable happens. The fear dissolves, and what's left is peace. Not the peace of having figured everything out, but the peace of realizing there was never anything to figure out in the first place. Let's look at what happens to people who actually go through this process, because this isn't just philosophy. There are people who've lived through ego dissolution, who've touched the experience of being nobody, and come back changed. In Anthony de Mello's writings, he describes what he calls waking up. He says, most people sleepwalk through life, completely identified with their thoughts and emotions, convinced that their self-concept is real, and then something happens, a crisis, a practice, a moment of grace, and they wake up. They see through the illusion. And according to de Mello, these people become impossible to manipulate. You can't flatter them because they're not invested in being special. You can't threaten them because they're not defending an identity. You can't control them with guilt or shame because they've seen through the story that creates those feelings. This isn't sociopathy. They still care about people, still act ethically, and still have compassion. But they're no longer operated by unconscious patterns. They're free in a way most people can't imagine. Buddhist nun Pema Chodron describes a similar transformation. She talks about how, before her practice deepened, she was constantly trying to feel solid, secure, and permanent, building up her sense of self, defending it against threats, seeking validation. And the more she tried to feel solid, the more anxious she became, because deep down she knew it was all precarious. But after years of meditation and study, something shifted. She stopped trying to be solid. She learned to rest in groundlessness, in the uncertainty and impermanence of everything. And paradoxically, that's when she found real stability. Not the stability of having a fixed identity, but the stability of being okay with having no fixed identity. Research on long-term meditators backs this up. Brain scans show decreased activity in regions associated with self-referential thinking. Psychological tests show lower levels of anxiety and depression and higher levels of well-being and life satisfaction. And subjectively, people report feeling more present, more connected, and less burdened by the past or worried about the future. But there's a shadow side to this too, because ego dissolution, when it happens suddenly or without proper context, can be destabilizing. People can interpret the loss of self as a sign of insanity, a psychotic break. They can feel alienated, unable to relate to others who are still operating from a strong sense of ego. This is why spiritual traditions emphasize the importance of guidance, of community, and of integrating these experiences into daily life. You can't just dissolve the ego and expect to function normally. You need a framework, a map, and some understanding of what's happening and why. And you need to be careful about spiritual materialism, the trap of making ego dissolution just another achievement for the ego to claim, "Look at me, I'm enlightened." I'm nobody. The moment you make it about you, you've missed the point entirely. Zen has a saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The tasks don't change. Life doesn't become magical. You still have to do the dishes, pay the bills, and deal with difficult people, but your relationship to it all shifts. There's less resistance, less complaint, and less sense that life should be different than it is. And strangely, that's when life becomes most vivid. When you stop demanding that it conform to your expectations, when you stop filtering everything through your self-concept, when you become nobody, life gets to be what it actually is. Raw, immediate, astonishing. So what does all of this mean for you, for your life, right now, with all its complexity and demands and responsibilities? Because you can't just disappear into a monastery, or drop out of society, or spend the next 10 years in a cave meditating. You have bills to pay, people who depend on you, and work to do. And besides, even if you could, that's not the point. The psychology of becoming nobody isn't about escaping life. It's about showing up for it more fully. Not as a character in a story you've been telling yourself, but as awareness itself, open and responsive to what is. And that can start small. It can start with noticing. Notice how often you're thinking about yourself. How much mental energy goes into maintaining your self-image, defending your positions, comparing yourself to others, and worrying about what people think of you. Just notice. Don't judge it. Don't try to change it. Just see it clearly, because the moment you see it, you're already stepping back from it. You're no longer completely identified with it. Notice how your sense of self contracts in moments of fear or shame or embarrassment, how it expands in moments of pride or validation. Notice how fragile it is, how much effort it takes to maintain, and how exhausting it is to constantly monitor and manage and defend. And then ask yourself, what would happen if I let go? Not permanently, not dramatically, but just for a moment. What if I stopped trying to be somebody and just existed? Right here, right now, without commentary or judgment or narrative? Try it, even for 10 seconds. Just be. Don't be anybody in particular. Don't be the successful version of yourself or the struggling version. Don't be the person you think you should be or the person you're afraid you are. Just be aware, noticing what's here. What do you find? Maybe nothing happens. Maybe it feels weird or uncomfortable. But maybe, just maybe, there's a sense of relief, a lightness, a recognition that you've been carrying a weight that was never necessary in the first place. The practice is to return to this, over and over, not to achieve some permanent state of egolessness, but to remember that you're not as solid or as permanent or as important as you think. And that remembering, that lightness, that's the beginning of freedom. You can still have goals, you can still care about things, you can still work hard and build things and make plans, but you hold it all more lightly. You're less attached to outcomes, less identified with success or failure, and less invested in being seen a certain way. And when you're less attached, you're actually more effective, because you're not operating from fear or neediness or the desperate hope that this achievement will finally make you feel complete. You're just responding to what's in front of you, doing what needs to be done, without the weight of your entire identity riding on every decision. This is what the Stoics understood. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, constantly reminded himself that he was nothing special, that death was coming, that his accomplishments would be forgotten, that none of it ultimately mattered. And rather than making him nihilistic or passive, it freed him to act virtuously, to do what was right without needing recognition or reward. He became nobody, and in becoming nobody, he became the best version of what a human could be. There's a beautiful paradox at the heart of all this. The more you try to become somebody, the more you suffer. But the moment you're willing to become nobody, you discover something vast and unshakable that was there all along. It's not that you disappear. It's that you stop mistaking the character for the actor, the wave for the ocean, and the clouds for the sky. And in that recognition, there's freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom from the prison of constant self-concern. Freedom from the exhausting project of trying to be somebody impressive, somebody lovable, somebody who matters. Because you already matter, not because of what you've done, or who you are, or what you've achieved, but because you're here, because awareness is happening through you, because existence itself is expressing through this particular form, right now, for this brief moment. And that's enough. It's always been enough. The mystics, the sages, and the people who've touched this and tried to bring it back in words, they all say the same thing in different languages. You are not who you think you are. You're so much more, and simultaneously, so much less. You're the space in which everything appears. You're the awareness that witnesses thoughts, emotions, sensations, experiences. You're not any of those things. You're what makes it possible for those things to be known at all. And when you realize this, really realize it, not intellectually, but experientially, everything changes. Not because the world changes, but because you've stopped being the center of your own universe. You've become nobody. And being nobody, it turns out, is the most liberating thing you'll ever experience. The path to becoming nobody is different for everyone. Some people come to it through crisis, through suffering so intense that their sense of self collapses under the weight. Some come to it through practice, through years of meditation, or prayer, or contemplative inquiry. Some stumble into it accidentally, through psychedelics, or near-death experiences, or moments of unexpected grace. But however you arrive, the destination is the same. A recognition that the self you've been defending all these years was never as solid as you thought, and that's not a tragedy. It's not a loss. It's a liberation. Because underneath that constructed self, there's something real. Not another self, not a better version of you, but awareness itself, empty, vast, unchanging. The ground of all experience, the space in which everything appears. And that, more than any achievement or identity or story you could tell about yourself, is what you actually are. So maybe the question isn't, who are you? Maybe the question is, what's here when you stop trying to be anybody at all? The answer is waiting. It's been waiting your whole life, and it's not going anywhere. All you have to do is stop. Stop defending. Stop performing. Stop trying to be somebody impressive or important or even competent. Just stop. And in that stopping, in that silence, in that space where the self used to be, you'll find something you never expected. Nothing and everything.